Two girls walked into a forest in Norway on a warm Friday evening in May. They never came back. What followed should have been a straightforward case. Police moved quickly, two men were arrested, one of them confessed, and for years, that was enough. The case was closed, the country moved on. But there was just one problem. Because the other man, the one who said he wasn't even there, never stopped claiming he was innocent, and decades later, when investigators took a closer look at what actually happened in Baneheia, they began to realize something deeply unsettling. This case might have been wrong from the very beginning. So what really happened in Baneheia? Kristiansand sits on Norway's southern coast. It's a mid-sized city, quiet, family-oriented, the kind of place where kids still play outside without their parents watching every move. In the summer of 2000, it had a population of just under 70,000 people. It was, by any definition, a safe place to raise a family. Baneheia is a forested recreational area right on the edge of the city. Trails cut through it, lakes sit inside it, and for generations of Kristiansand families, it had been a place for walks, bike rides, and summer swims. Parents sent their children there without a second thought. On the evening of Friday, May 19, 2000, 8-year-old Stina Sophie Sørstrønen and 10-year-old Lena Slugedal Paulsen set off toward Baneheia for an evening swim. They were friends. They were children. The lake they headed for, known locally as Third Stomp, was a familiar spot. They had been there before. It was close. It was safe. But this time, they didn't come home. When the girls failed to return that night, families raised the alarm. A search operation was launched. For 2 full days, searchers combed the trails and shoreline. 2 days of not knowing, 2 days of desperate hope. On May 21st, 2000, their bodies were found, hidden under a pine bush and branches not far from the water's edge. Both girls had been sexually assaulted. Both had been killed. The horror of what had been done to them was almost impossible to absorb. Kristiansand and all of Norway was shaken to its core. Thousands of people attended a memorial march for the girls just 10 days later. Children and adults placed flowers and letters and soft toys at the site where they were found. The grief was enormous, and underneath the grief there was something else, a demand for answers, a demand for someone to be held responsible. The police needed to find who did this, and they needed to find them fast. In the weeks that followed, investigators in Kristiansand worked through a painstaking process of interviews and tip-offs. The case attracted enormous public attention. There was pressure, real pressure, to solve this, to give the community something to hold on to. Then on September 13th, 2000, nearly 4 months after the murders, police arrested 2 young local men. Their names were Viggo Kristiansen and Jan Helge Andersen. Viggo Kristiansen was 21 years old. Jan Helge Andersen was 19. They knew each other. They were, in the broadest sense, acquaintances, and they both lived in the area around Baneheia. What happened next would define the next 2 decades. Jan Helge Andersen confessed. He admitted to stabbing one of the girls. He told police that Viggo Kristiansen had been with him, that Kristiansen was the one in charge, that Kristiansen was the main perpetrator. Andersen's cooperation was extensive. He was detailed. He gave investigators a version of events that seemed to lock his accomplice in. Viggo Kristiansen said he had nothing to do with it. He had never been in Baneheia that evening. He was innocent. But the case against him appeared strong. Andersen's testimony, DNA evidence that investigators said connected Kristiansen to one of the victims, and cell phone data that placed Kristiansen's phone near the area at the relevant time. In June 2001, the court in Kristiansand convicted both men. Kristiansen was sentenced to 21 years of preventive detention, the harshest sentence in the Norwegian system. Andersen received a reduced sentence of 17 years, later increased to 19 on appeal, in part because he had cooperated and because prosecutors argued he was the less dominant of the two. The convictions were appealed, they were upheld. Viggo Kristiansen appealed to the Supreme Court. His appeal was rejected in April 2002, and with that, the case appeared to be closed. Except Viggo Kristiansen never stopped saying he was innocent. Not once, not in year 1, not in year 10, not in year 20. And here is where the story starts to unravel. In any criminal case, the evidence either holds up over time or it doesn't. Forensic science advances, new analysis becomes possible. Details that once seemed airtight begin to develop cracks. In the Baneheia case, the cracks became chasms. Let's go back to the evidence. There were 3 pillars that held up the conviction of Viggo Kristiansen. First, Jan Helge Andersen's testimony pointing to him as the main offender. Second, DNA evidence. Third, cell phone location data. Each of these would be challenged, seriously challenged. The DNA evidence was the most technically complex. At the time of the original trial, analysts had found biological material at the scene that they said was consistent with Kristiansen. But DNA analysis in 2000 was not what it is today. The methodologies have changed significantly, and when new forensic experts examined the original evidence decades later, they reached a strikingly different conclusion. The DNA that had been used to help convict Kristiansen was, in the view of the new analysts, not reliable. The match was weaker than originally presented, far weaker. In fact, some experts concluded it was not a match at all. That finding alone was enough to shake the foundation of the conviction. Then there was the cell phone data. Mobile positioning evidence in 2000 was blunt. Cell towers covered wide areas. Placing a phone near Baneheia did not mean placing its owner inside Baneheia at a specific moment. The technology simply couldn't do that with the precision the prosecution implied. Later examination of this evidence suggested it was far more ambiguous than the jury had been led to believe. And then there was Jan Helge Andersen himself. Andersen served his sentence. He was granted early release in January 2016, and by September 2019 he was fully free. He had walked out of prison after admitting to killing one child and directing blame for the other onto Viggo Kristiansen. And Viggo Kristiansen was still inside, still insisting he had done nothing. Meanwhile, Kristiansen had submitted 4 previous applications to have his case reviewed. 4 times the Commission for the Review of Criminal Cases had said no, but in February 2021, that changed. After years of pressure, new legal argument, and new forensic reports, the Commission voted 3-2 to reopen the case, 3 against 2. The decision was not unanimous, but it was enough. The majority concluded that the new expert reports had undermined the DNA evidence to such a degree that there was a reasonable possibility Kristiansen would have been acquitted if those findings had been available in 2002. The Supreme Court's Appeals Committee then sent the case to Borgarting Court of Appeal for a full review. A new investigation was launched, and what that investigation turned up changed everything. Because here is the thing that investigators found in November 2021, the detail that nobody had properly confronted before. Jan Helge Andersen's DNA was found on both victims, both of them, including Lena Slugedal Paulsen, the girl he had always said he did not kill, the girl he claimed Viggo Kristiansen murdered alone, his DNA on both victims. This was not what he had told police. This was not what the court had heard. This was not the basis on which he had been convicted and then released. The original case against Andersen had him directly involved only with Stina Sophie Sørstrunen. He had been acquitted of the killing of Lena Slugedal Paulsen, and now forensic evidence placed him with her too. In July 2022, Andersen was formally charged with the murder of Lena Slugedal Paulsen. The man who had walked free in 2016 was now facing trial again, and on December 13, 2022, Viggo Kristiansen was acquitted. Borgarting Court of Appeal, in a decision consistent with the prosecution's own recommendation, found him not guilty. After nearly 21 years in prison, after 4 failed attempts to reopen his case, after 2 decades of telling anyone who would listen that he was not there, he was not guilty. The Norwegian Justice Minister formally apologized to Viggo Kristiansen on the day of the acquittal. The state launched an inquiry commission to determine how the wrongful conviction had happened, and Kristiansen was awarded 55 million Norwegian kroner in compensation. At the time, the largest compensation amount ever granted in a Norwegian miscarriage of justice case, 55 million kroner for 21 years, for a crime he did not commit. Now let's slow down here, because it is important to sit with the full scope of what happened. This was not a case where the evidence was vague from the beginning. This was not a situation where investigators had nothing and took a gamble. The police, the prosecutors, the courts at multiple levels, they all believed they had their men. The DNA findings had been presented as compelling. Anderson's confession and testimony seemed to corroborate the case against Kristiansen. The cell phone evidence appeared to place him at the scene, and yet none of it was true, or at least none of it was as solid as it appeared. How does something like this happen? The investigation commission that was established in February 2023 took on the task of finding out. Their work would ultimately produce a comprehensive and damning report, but already by 2022, certain things were clear. The press, for one, had played a role. Kristiansand's main regional newspaper, Fædrelandsvennen, commissioned its own independent review of its coverage. The conclusion was blunt. The press had contributed to prejudging Kristiansen. There had been a clear absence of critical questioning of the police's account of what happened in Baneheia. Journalists had largely accepted the official narrative. The adversarial scrutiny that might have identified the weaknesses in the case earlier simply did not happen. That is not a comfortable thing for any institution to admit, but they admitted it. There is also the question of confirmation bias within the investigation itself. Once investigators had settled on Viggo Kristiansen as a suspect, the evidence appears to have been interpreted through that lens. The DNA findings that were uncertain were presented as more definitive than they were. The cell phone positioning data that was ambiguous was treated as placing him specifically at the scene. And Anderson's account, which was detailed and cooperative, was treated as reliable, even though he was obviously a man with every reason to shift responsibility. But then there is another layer to this, because when the new investigation began in 2021 and Anderson's DNA was found on both girls, the question had to be asked, had he ever actually had an accomplice? The court that heard Anderson's new trial in 2024 addressed this directly. They concluded unanimously that there was no reasonable doubt. Anderson had killed Lena Slugedal Paulsen, and he had done it alone, not with Viggo Kristiansen. Alone. Think about what that means. If Jan Helge Andersen acted alone on May 19, 2000, then the entire account he gave police, the account that sent Kristiansen to prison, was a fabrication, not a partial distortion, not a version of events shaped by fear or confusion, a deliberate, detailed lie. A lie that cost an innocent man 21 years of his life. The trial that finally held Anderson properly accountable began on April 16, 2024, at Sør-Rogaland District Court in Sandnes. 8 weeks were set aside for it. Anderson testified. Viggo Kristiansen also gave testimony. The two men, now in their early to mid-40s, faced each other in the courtroom. Anderson maintained a position throughout. He had not acted alone. There had been someone else there. His story, even now, even in the face of DNA evidence that the court found utterly damning, was that he was not the only perpetrator. On July 2, 2024, the verdict came down. Jan Helge Andersen was convicted of the murder of Lena Slugedal Paulsen. The court was unanimous. They found no doubt that he was the sole perpetrator. He was sentenced to 2 additional years in prison, added to the 19 years from his original conviction. 2 years. 2 years as additional punishment for the murder of a 10-year-old girl? A murder he had originally been acquitted of. A murder for which an innocent man spent over 2 decades in prison. The legal reasoning behind the relatively modest sentence was technical. The 2 years were additive, applied to a sentence he had already served. Anderson had been free since 2019. What the sentence meant in practical terms was complicated. Anderson announced he would appeal. Let's step back once more, because there are still questions in this case that have not been cleanly resolved. If Anderson acted alone, why did he confess to a joint attack? The obvious answer is self-interest. By naming an accomplice, by presenting himself as the lesser of two perpetrators, he positioned himself for leniency. His cooperation, he argued at the time, was worth something, and the court agreed. His original 19-year sentence reflected that cooperation. A sentence that was shorter than what Kristiansen received as the supposed ringleader. By implicating Kristiansen, Anderson got a lighter sentence for a crime that, if he committed it alone, was entirely and wholly his. Whether the fabrication of Kristiansen's involvement was planned or improvised in the moment of the original interrogation, we cannot know with certainty. What we know is that it worked for 21 years. And then there is the question of the investigation itself. Viggo Kristiansen from the very beginning said he was not there. He had no memory to offer that would place him at the scene because he was not at the scene. In any investigation, the absence of a suspect's corroborating detail can be interpreted either way, as innocence or as deliberate vagueness. Investigators chose the latter interpretation. They built a case around Anderson's testimony and found evidence they believed supported it. The lesson that emerges from the Baneheia case is uncomfortable. It is this. In a case with enormous emotional weight, under enormous public pressure, with a confession from one suspect naming another, the justice system did not perform its most basic function. It did not test the evidence with sufficient rigor. It did not apply the skepticism that the defendant's consistent denial demanded. It convicted a man who said he was innocent, and it believed a man who was lying. The families of Stina Sofie Sørstrunen and Lena Slogedal Paulsen have carried this case for 25 years. Stina Sofie's mother, Ada Sophie Austegard, channeled her grief into action. In August 2000, just months after losing her daughter, she co-founded Steen Sofie's Stiftelse, the Steen Sofie Foundation. The organization works to strengthen the legal protections for children who are victims of violence, to prevent what happened to those two girls from happening to others. By 2021, the foundation had grown to 66 employees and turned over 66 million kroner annually. A remarkable and deeply moving legacy built from the most devastating possible loss. But even with that legacy, even with the acquittal of Kristiansen and the belated conviction of Anderson for both murders, there is no clean ending here. The full story of what happened in Baneheia on May 19, 2000 still has gaps. The investigation commission tasked with examining how Kristiansen came to be wrongfully convicted was working through its findings well into 2023 and beyond. The question of whether the original investigation was conducted with appropriate rigor, whether tunnel vision set in early, whether key evidence was handled correctly, whether the pressure to solve a high-profile case led investigators in the wrong direction, those are serious institutional questions that take time to properly answer. Anderson, as of the 2024 verdict, continued to deny that he acted alone. His appeal was pending. The legal process continued. And Viggo Kristiansen, a free man since June 2021, was trying to rebuild a life after a childhood, a young adulthood, and an entire early middle age spent inside a Norwegian prison for something he did not do. 55 million kroner is the most Norway had ever paid anyone in a wrongful conviction. No amount of money gives back 21 years. The girls, Stein, Sophie, and Lena, deserve to be remembered for who they were. 8 years old and 10 years old. Children on their way to a swim on a spring evening. Their families have never been able to simply grieve. The case followed them and never let go. Even the conviction of the right man after all this time cannot undo the decades of confusion and injustice that surrounded their deaths. What the Baneheia case tells us is something about the limits of certainty, about the difference between a compelling story and the truth, about what happens when the pressure to find an answer is greater than the patience to find the right one. A confession, it turns out, is not the same thing as the truth. Cooperation from a suspect, it turns out, can be the most calculated form of deception. Evidence that appears definitive, it turns out, can dissolve entirely under the light of a better methodology. Viggo Kristiansen was convicted because investigators believed they had solved a horrific crime. Jan Helge Andersen let them believe that, and for 21 years it held. What made it finally fall apart was time, new science, a man who kept fighting, and eventually a commission willing to say that the original answer had been wrong. That is cold comfort for the families of those two girls, for Viggo Kristiansen, for everyone who trusted the system to get it right the first time. But it is where we are. Two girls walked into a forest in Kristiansand on the 19th of May, 2000. They never came home. And the truth about what happened to them, the full, complete truth, took 24 years and multiple trials to even partially emerge. Whether we now have the whole picture, that question still lingers. Thank you for joining me to take a look at this case. This is Unsolved Case Files, and I'll see you in the next one.